Soul Sessions, conversations to inspire your journey through life. I'm your host, Susan Kiskis.
And I'm Jose Johnson.
And I'm Rickie Freedman.
And today's topic is inclusiveness and spirituality. We have a wonderful guest we'll be introducing to you shortly, but let's dive in. So, Jose, this was actually a topic that you wanted to bring to Soul Sessions. So can you share with us a little bit about why this was a topic that inspired you?
Well, for a couple different reasons. One, societally right now we seem to be seeing more and more division and exclusion that occurs, and especially when it comes down to our beliefs. So where our spirituality should be something that raises us to our higher self, because of the exclusive nature sometimes of different religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs, it's actually created more problems, and we see more and more hatred and tension and wars breaking out over simple things like how we believe. And I think it's so important for people to understand that each of us finds our own spiritual path, and that when we can appreciate that in each other, that we can break down a lot of boundaries and find out that we really have much more in common in our beliefs than the dogma that sometimes creates the tension between people.
Right. The bigger, higher truths are always connecting and love-based. Love, forgiveness, compassion. And so we can stay in love and out of fear. We have much more to connect about than there is to be separated about. One of my favorite expressions here in Reiki space is the source, of course.
That's fantastic. For me, religion and spirituality are tools to help us answer these questions that we've had since the beginning of time. Who am I? How did I get here? Where am I going? And it provides such a wonderful opportunity for us to explore those answers. And I find it interesting how we then develop a tool, whether that's a specific religion or a spiritual belief that works for us, and then really kind of create the dogma around it. And this is not just for me, this is the way, the truth, right? And I think that's where sometimes is the sticky point, is that instead of sharing in the joy that we all have these different ways this story is being told, right, is that we really hold on to ours and believe that ours is right. And so I really loved the fact that you were bringing this topic, because I think it's a nice reminder for all of us that at the end of the day, it is all about love, and it's about finding these answers to those big questions that we've had.
Because it really is all about connection.
Yeah.
Within and...
I thought it was a perfect topic for soul, because
Yes.
soul and spirit is such a intermingled concept. So and for me, like the Tao Te Ching speaks to me a lot. And the first verse of the Tao Te Ching is, the Tao which can be named is not the true Tao. So we're all on this path towards this higher truth. But as soon as we define it, it stops being what it truly is. So we're all just grabbing a little glimpse of what really is out there. And I think if we become more inclusive, then we start to see the big picture, not just our own limited perspective on things.
Right.
Oh, I love that. That reminds me of my, I study Hindi, and so my Hindi teacher, he gives me a little bit of like a lesson on Indian culture and Hindi culture at the end of our lessons. And he was talking about how so in the concept of Hinduism, there's, multiple gods and there's different practices, but how you don't worry about what your aunt or your mother or your father or your friend or your neighbor are actually doing. Because even though they may not be doing puja as often as you, or they might not be doing the same arti as you, that it's still accepted that you are who you are and you believe what you believe, and the way that you practice is personal, but that doesn't mean that you're outside of it.
Right.
And it is very inclusive the way he was describing it, which is what I absolutely love. It's you can't kind of put a pin in this is just it.
Right. Because labels will create a box, and that's what we don't want. We don't want that unification.
So the one question I also have is that, how do we take what is human nature and then start to massage it for inclusiveness, right? Because the mind categorizes things. It's like our minds have these folders, and everything has to go into a folder, or we call them boxes. And when it doesn't, the mind kind of doesn't know what to do when we go in a state of fear, and then fear usually kind of pushes against it. So how do we also open up that conversation of understanding that these are natural reactions, but we need to kind of step back from them?
Great question.
That's a great question.
That might be a great question for our guest
I
today.
think so too.
Right, well, our guest for today is Reverend Howard West. Reverend Howard West III is an ordained Presbyterian minister with a specialized ministry focusing on geriatric spiritual care, dementia, end-of-life care, and caregiver support. He has a master's in counseling from the University of Pittsburgh and a master's in divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. Howard has over 28 years of experience working with self-help groups, addressing family and relationship problems, addiction, codependency, depression, and other mental health issues. So we would like to welcome Reverend Howard West.
Thank you, Jose. Well, I'm very excited to be here today. And when you came up with this topic, one of the reasons why I was excited about it is when we talk about inclusivity and spirituality or religion, I think a lot of people tend to go right to political issues, right? When we hear about inclusivity, especially in the political environment today, people automatically go maybe to LGBT issues or racism, and those are important. But the angle I'm coming from today is perfectly addressed in a healing place. This is a healing place. And that's how I got into ministry in the first place. I didn't want to become clergy initially. I'm actually third generation clergy. My uncle and my grandfather were clergy. I came into this through working in the prison system in a therapeutic community where we had inmates from the general population who wanted healing. And so in some sense, they had to be excluded from the general population to be included in an environment that was therapeutic and healing. And we used, as you mentioned in the introduction, we used part of the program was focused on 12-step recovery and the 12-step readings and groups. And within that context, I really discovered my deeper spirituality, which eventually led me to seminary and then took me into geriatric spiritual care where I am today. And the population I'm most concerned about now that's being excluded are older adults, and especially people with dementia and Alzheimer's.
Yes.
And I have found, as the director of spiritual care at Country Meadows, that spirituality is the key to overcoming this dilemma of exclusivity and helping people feel included.
Beautiful.
And Country Meadows is a retirement community, senior center in central Pennsylvania.
Right, we're a retirement community. We have 11 facilities in Pennsylvania and one in Frederick, Maryland. And we have about 2,800 residents. And we have chaplains at all of our facilities who oversee spiritual care on the campuses.
Yeah, that's beautiful. My background was in physical therapy before I learned Rickie, and I did a lot of work in geriatric care. And through the healing power of touch, many people who weren't able to speak or understand were able to find that connection without words. So it's very beautiful.
Well, and you had mentioned earlier how we're going to address this problem of exclusivity and have inclusivity. And I think we're already sitting in the solution right now. I see it more as an issue of healing, of experiential healing that individuals have to experience, and not so much a political or theological issue. You know, when Pope Francis came to visit the Congress, was about 2 years ago, in his speech that he gave to Congress, he said that anything with an ism on the end is a form of idolatry. And I think this is sort of at the root of what is disconnecting and wounding people in society, is this worship of ideologies, of theologies, of political beliefs. And when we can get down on a personal level of spirituality, that's where I think the changes can occur. And you know, we need to differentiate the two terms. The way I look at it is spirituality is more of a personal experience of beliefs and practices, and religion tends to be more institutional and organizational with doctrines, dogma, a hierarchy. And you know, one of my favorite Catholic writers, Father James Martin, who's a Jesuit, you know, he says it doesn't have to be either or, spirituality or religion. The best is a marriage, and some writers say that spirituality is a personal corrective for the mistakes that are made by institutions and religion.
Interesting.
So that's how I see those two going together. And I think, therefore, as people explore healing, whether it's through Reiki or Tai Chi or their Christian faith, it sets them on that road of experience to feel connected. I heard you mention the word connected. And when we connect internally with ourselves, our soul, right, and when we connect externally with others and our environment, let's not forget the planet, there's a wholeness and a healing that comes from that. That, as there's an old saying goes, that when you live in the solution, the problem takes care of itself. And that's sort of how I see the solution.
Yeah, and it can go either direction. The healing can lead to the connection, and the connection leads to the healing. So that's beautiful.
And as you know, as a Reiki master, and with your martial arts training, it's really, I think, spirituality is more. Religion sometimes more about being a leader, a teacher, a controller, and I see spirituality and spiritual practitioners as being a channel. That we're channeling something deeper and more powerful, a higher power, God, Allah, or if you want to talk about chi, body, energy. We're a channel, and that connectedness provides a means of healing, but it also provides healing on the end of the person providing the healing that maybe would be disconnected otherwise when they get caught up with debates about religion and theology and politics.
I think one of the things that I can see in religion that translates to the concept of spirituality that I find so important and so beautiful, but I think we ignore so often in the scope of how its power is the power of community and the power of gathering. So, whether it's Quaker gatherings or going to church on Sunday or temple, it's having that camaraderie with your fellow congregation. That also in Buddhism, that is your sangha, and they remind you to stay on the path of goodness, or remind you of who you are, and the love and the beauty in the world. And I feel like when we are together in those groups where we share these beautiful expressions of love, and that it really charges and invigorates us and reminds us for a certain amount of time. And then once we've kind of pulled away from that, we start to forget until around those spiritual family members that remind us. And I'm curious if you have any stories you'd like to share about how the power of groups can really help shine a light on inclusion and spirituality across religious and spiritual values.
Well, I ran groups in the community as a therapist in the State College area, and then I worked at the State Correctional Institution in Huntington, Pennsylvania. That's a men's maximum security prison, therapeutic community, therapy groups there. And then I've done groups at churches, support groups, and then I've had a lot of involvement professionally and personally with 12-step programs over the years. I think you're onto something that's very important. When we look at the common threads of spirituality in all the different world religions, right? We have themes like love, compassion for the other person, and this idea of connectedness and community. We have Buddhist monks that live in community in Asia, right? And if you look at the Catholic Church, many of the great saints, St. Augustine, St. Benedict, Teresa of Avila, they all ended up starting religious communities that restored a sense of spirituality and healing within that particular faith. So in my experience, what I see in the groups that I've run is, on the first level, is it gives people an opportunity to open up and be more transparent. And I think a lot of people in our world today have a lot of walls up, and we're helping them put walls up with all of these screens that they put in front of themselves when they're communicating. The family that sits at the table and they're all texting each other instead of having a conversation. So I think in the first step in groups that I look at, and this includes when I do dementia groups with people that have Alzheimer's who are cognitively impaired, is giving people a chance to feel like they can share who they really are and to be heard and understood for who they really are. And when people feel heard and unconditionally accepted for just being who they are, that opens a whole door for personal growth and spirituality. Now, you can go into deeper levels too, where I have groups where we confront people and maybe challenge people. But the biggest thing I think people are looking for is a sense of belonging. I get a lot of people that come up to me in my work, and say, I consider myself a spiritual person, but I don't go to church anymore because I feel like I can't connect. What's that about?
Yeah.
And then I also see, throughout the country, churches, and this is not meant to be, I don't want to be overly critical of Christianity or churches that are dying, they can't get enough people to come on Sunday, and then they have hundreds of people attending AA or Overeater Anonymous or Al-Anon meetings in the basement of the church.
Wow.
Why is that? What is the difference? And I've asked myself about that, and I think it has to do with this connection and spiritual community, being authentic, being heard, being loved, even when people know your worst stuff, not being judged. That's very important for our friends with dementia that I work with. We have conversations sometimes with 5 people, and they're on 5 different pages, right? I don't even know what page they're on. But through our interaction of feeling loved and heard, they feel like they belong. And then that cultivates a sense of the soul being filled and being cared about and loved. That's just so important. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
It does. And it even frames for me what people are seeking in God or higher power is that unconditional love that we had since infancy, and applying it though to community. And once they do feel safe, then they do feel, like you said, they can just open their heart and their soul and just express the highest form of love and compassion there is, because fear's gone then. And the fear, as we were talking about, was one of my concerns, is how do we comprehend that sometimes our first reaction to something that we don't know is fear, which then becomes anger and mistrust, and recognize that this is a reaction that's built within us for survival, but that once we step out of that, we realize that it's safe and it's okay, that we can learn to love and accept everyone, no matter what path they're walking.
Well, I was saying that to Rickie before we started, that one of my favorite theologian philosophers is Martin Buber, and he's very famous for describing relationships as being 2 types. The I-thou relationship, right? Thou, you, I as a being, you as a being in relationship, versus the I-it, an objective relationship, like an object. And I think so many people out there want that connection. And as you said, it's love. It's a connection where I'm unique, you're unique, our relationship is unique, and there's an unconditional care there that can't be easily expressed. One of the most important things I've learned from working, as a therapist in support groups is the spiritual paradox that Ernest Kurtz, who is, he's passed away, I think last year, he was a historian that wrote a book about Alcoholics Anonymous called Not God. And one of the things that he identified and later wrote a book about is the topic of the spirituality of imperfection. And I think this is one of the great spiritual paradoxes, and the paradoxes of love, is I love you even though you blah, blah, blah. Right? And anyone that's been in a relationship for a long time or they're married knows that when you really love someone, you love everything, not just the good parts. And I think that so much of our relationships in society are conditional. And one thing I'm really concerned about, and I talked to a friend of mine who's a Catholic Monsignor up in Scranton, is how we've promoted this culture. And when you look at kids in schools today, where everything's about competition and comparing. And think about that. Competition and comparing are relationships that are based off of competing with each other about your good parts, your strong parts. And then what happens is, because people don't want to damage children's self-esteem, they give everybody an award so that the feedback they're getting isn't really productive in terms of the value of the person, even with their flaws. We don't need to say, you got a participation trophy even though you're no good. What we need to say is, you did really poorly and I love you just as much.
Yes.
Nothing you do that's wrong or failure could ever break that love.
Yes.
And since I'm working with geriatrics and dementia, think about it. If we look at aging from a utilitarian point of view, there are a bunch of old people that can't work anymore, they're a drain on the insurance system, blah, blah, blah. But when we look at them in terms of wisdom and life experience, and the way they're showing us how to live life when you're struggling with physical or mental challenges, there's so much wisdom there. And my favorite group to work with is the Alzheimer's dementia group, because there is a love and a purity there sometimes that I feel with people that have cognitive impairment, that they aren't thinking about all the other egotistical,
Right.
narcissistic stuff that you and I are thinking
And
about.
no
when we're
guarding.
talking. There's
Right.
it's just no filter, you know.
So Howard, you and I have known each other for a while, and we've had this conversation, but just so that, to fill everybody else in, I also came from three generations of ministers, and was brought up in that environment of the very traditional, somewhat evangelical, religious upbringing, which I embraced for a while, and then completely turned my back on, and kind of, I didn't even want to hear the word religion or spirituality. And then found myself coming back full circle and being able to look at things, because I was able to see the dark underbelly of religion, being behind the doors and knowing the people that are involved. And now that I've kind of got a different perspective on life, of seeing how it all is just part of something much greater, something that we don't understand. And for you, how did you come to terms with being in a position where you have to be inclusive, where you're doing a service for a Christian believer, and then maybe you have to do a Jewish ceremony, or you have someone of a different religious or spiritual belief system? How do you utilize spirituality to reach them, and breaking down the barriers that religion sometimes sets up for us?
Well, what I do is I try to put myself in the other person's shoes. Everyone has a different sense of spirituality, and when I'm involved in a service or an event of another faith, I try to understand who is there and how is that helping their spirituality. How do they relate to that? That has been a problem for some of the chaplains that I've worked with over the years, and we've had to part ways, because one of the problems with organized religion is it can get into a power struggle where one person is trying to dominate or demonstrate that their faith is better than the other person. So I suspend judgment, and even though I may disagree with people, I ask myself, how is this helping that person connect to their God, their higher power? And sometimes it's pretty hard. That's one of my jokes as I talk to other people, is every day I have to live with my number one resentment, which is organized religion, and unfortunately I work in it.
Yeah.
But that's a good tension. That's a tension that prevents me from going to some extreme and imposing my ways on other people, and also allows me to be tolerant for other people and realize that we're all human, that nobody does have a monopoly on the whole truth. It is sad, though, when I hear stories like yours, Jose, and I almost a week doesn't go by that I don't meet at least one or two people who've been wounded by religion. And one of my phrases is, I'll take a good pagan seeker over a Christian know-it-all any day of the week, because spirituality has to include some type of openness to learn and to grow. And when people have a belief system that's rigid and controlling, it's really hard to grow. And that's one of the things I find too, working with geriatric care, is it's exciting to work with people in their 80s and 90s and even their hundreds, and we talk about, hey, this is your last chance to figure out what's really going on here. And another rule of thumb I have is I don't want to hire any chaplains that are less open-minded than our residents, and they're extremely open-minded, so it's a high bar.
I love that. I love that.
Because they've seen a lot.
Yeah.
They've had the rigid beliefs shattered by life experience.
Absolutely.
And there's an openness and a love there that makes them actually much more spiritual than younger people.
Right, and that bringing it back to that tension of opposites of our human self versus the bigger not versus, and at the same time the bigger, higher truth.
Well, when you talked about your family, Jose, that's the joke I have with people. If you've never had a crisis of faith, just join a committee at your local church.
Or
'cause-
synagogue.
Or synagogue, or synagogue, or
Because
mosque, or
it's
whatever.
universal,
Because
yes,
it's universal. When you get into the
absolutely.
institutional dimension, see, there's religion, the institutional dimension, and all the human social psychology kicks in about, egos and power struggles, But I think it's good if we can balance both.
Right.
And my wife and her family are Catholic, and I'm Presbyterian and Protestant. And if we can talk and share and learn from each other, we can come out so much the better for it, without that power struggle.
Right.
I always think about that the Rumi story about the elephant. That the blind men and the
Right.
elephant, and each one of them is touching
yes,
a different part of the
yes.
elephant and describing what it is. And I kind of look at religion that way because the concept of whatever higher power you want to name, because as humans we have the need to anthropomorphize everything.
Yeah, of
We
course.
create I think about the old Jethro Tull album Aqualung, and on the back it said, "In the beginning was man, and man created God in his image." Well, which is kind of an interesting thought because
deep.
we do want to put a perspective on God or whatever higher power we worship to make it like us, instead of thinking that we're like it's like us. So as we start to experience things, and you look at, like you're saying, like the Hindu practices where there are multiple gods and each of them is different and it looks different and has a different characteristic, and it's really interesting that there are so many different ways that you can perceive and relate to this greater energy, being,
Right.
spirit that is out there, and that by the communication and the sharing with each other, we start to find the common ground. And it's much like the way I approach my studies, my teachings in martial arts and other things, is I'm always looking for what's the golden thread that runs through everything I do, and that's the universal truth. And everything else is just the decoration,
That's
the flavor. And I think that if we could find a way to have more open conversations about what's the underlying truth, and then look at the external differences as the things that make things more enjoyable
Interesting,
and
yes.
interesting, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to finding them as points of contention. So as you're working with, especially the geriatrics, I can see, because of having that
Life
big
experience.
perspective of life, and seeing that they're feeling that they're on the final leg of their journey. Have you seen a trend for them to be much more open and considerate and thoughtful to what spirituality may actually be, what God may be to them, really kind of defining in a more clear and concise way as they've gotten older?
I definitely see that, and for several reasons. One of them is a lot of folks, when they move into residential geriatric care, they lose touch with the synagogues or the churches that they attended. It just logistically dislocates them from that. But I think part of what people struggle with in old age, and I think is a really dangerous thing, is loneliness, right? And believe it or not, that ties in with my prison work, that when I worked in the prison system, I was really surprised to find out that the greatest fear that inmates have in a prison is not being assaulted or something like that. It's dying alone in a prison.
Wow.
And I think that's the deepest human fear that we all deal with, is being alone. And what I found with working in geriatrics, and the way our company operates, we're very it's a community model that we use. People have seen a lot of religious things come and go, but they want to connect as a community, and when they do that, their spirituality kind of just naturally opens them up to meeting with other people. Some are more religious than others. Catholic residents tend to be more religious than Protestant residents, who tend to be more religious than our smaller number of Jewish residents, or more culturally Jewish. But the point is that I think the life experience they've had have shown them the limits of religion, and their need to feel like they belong and to address loneliness opens them up to the importance of relationships. So those factors come together, and people, I think, in their old age are at their spiritual peak. I tell them that. I'll tell them that this afternoon when I'm doing a service out on why I'm missing. Is you may be retired from your job or what you used to do, but you're not retired from your spiritual life until you meet your Maker.
Right.
And it's your job every day to go out and connect with people and to grow. Because while the body gets old and decays, the spirit can keep growing indefinitely until we go to the afterlife.
I mean, it comes like if you think about like the yin yang concept, that if you think about the yang as being the physical and the yin as being spiritual, or whatever.
That's a
think
great
about it,
point.
That as you get to the extreme of one, you're starting the other. So and conversely, as you get to the decline of one, you're getting to the growth of the other. So as our bodies are decaying, our spirits are getting ready for that transition to that next phase of our existence. However you want to think about that, whether it's we're going to heaven, or we're just changing into energy and going back into the cosmos. But we're at that point where the transition is getting ready to occur. So we become more and more aware of that aspect. We feel it pulling us in that direction.
More contemplative about.
Well, we come into life close to God, and then we kind of get further away, and then at the end we come back. And there's an old saying, once a man, twice a child. And then we see in Christian literature when Jesus talked to people that whoever can return to being like these children will really be closer to God. And one of my other great favorite writers is Father Richard Rohr. He's a Franciscan priest, and he has a story he's told in some of his lectures about a woman brought a baby home from the hospital, and there was a 4-year-old little brother, and he was in talking to the baby in the crib, and she listened in, and she heard the 4-year-old say to the newborn baby, "Quick, tell me what God is about. I'm already beginning to forget."
Oh.
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah, that's a great story that Richard Rohr tells.
Yes.
But I see that. There is the full circle that we come out pure and close to God, and then we get corrupted and then come back as we're older, and things can begin to simplify. And that's where the healing comes in too. There's a lot of older people too that are struggling with accepting aging and the pain, the physical pain, the social dislocation, and that's where love and support and community really are the medicine. They're the most important,
And
right?
people, and I've seen this in my work, but also in my family, and with my mom, as she was getting ready, the material things become totally unimportant,
Exactly.
and it's all about connection and relationship, and that curiosity about, where are things heading? Where am I going? Right?
Well, my Uncle Bob, he was the Lutheran pastor. He said, hey, when you get to the end, there's only 2 questions. Where are you going and what are you leaving behind?
That's right.
And a lot of people, as they get closer to the end, realize that, that material stuff they can't put it in a coffin and ship it with you to wherever you're going. Legacy is important. That's something that I think people think a lot about.
Beautiful.
So Howard, let me ask you this. As we're thinking about the general environment right now where socially where there is so much exclusion, and if we want to make change, we can't look to our leaders to make change. We have to look within ourselves. What are things that you could suggest to people to do that might be able to help them to open up their minds, open up their hearts, open up their souls a little bit to spiritual inclusive nature?
Well, I just did a memorial service last week. Someone who used to work with our company, and one of the things I talked about at the memorial service is that this family lost a loved one to cancer, and they're really hurting. They need love. They need support. And I looked at everyone that was sitting in the funeral home, and I said, and it's incumbent upon every one of you that you have a role to play in this family's life to provide love and support and healing for them through their grief. And later, I talked to one of the people I work with, and I said, didn't you used to play, miniature golf with, the widower? Oh yeah, we used to do that. I said, are you gonna call him up and play miniature golf sometime? He's like, yeah. Why asking? I said, because he needs to get reconnected. And I guess here's the answer to your question. Rather than thinking immediately at a religious solution, I encourage people to look at relationships in your life, at work, in your family, and others, that you're in touch with, and how can you connect with them on a level where you're experiencing love and support and connectedness. Now, obviously, if you have a faith community or a synagogue or a church, continue with that. But I think it's more on a day-to-day level that spirituality is a way we practice our life on a daily basis of connecting with other people so that people can experience something deeper through us. Of course, love is the deepest, but there's other things too. There's wisdom, there's compassion, there's also
forgiveness.
I was just going to get around to forgiveness. I always say the two big things people seem to miss out of the gospel, about Jesus is he was just a regular guy that had to eat and go to the bathroom every day. And it's about forgiveness, because there's so much resentment out there and broken relationships. There's a lot of families out there that are broken. And we can be the brother, the sister, the uncle, the father to someone who's been left out, who doesn't belong. And by making that connection, I think that starts the healing process where the spirituality can evolve naturally.
Beautiful, yes. So I was wondering, before we wind up today, if you would be kind enough to lead us in a peace blessing.
Okay. Well, being that I'm from a Christian tradition, I guess it'll be more Christian-esque, but Lord God, we know you by many names and many traditions. And I thank you that in this relationship that we've had here filming today and through the relationship with people who will view this video, that you would bless us all by raising our consciousness of the importance of connecting in the Spirit, and by realizing that spirituality is more than a feeling, it's more than just a perspective. It's a way of life in which our connectedness with others brings healing and love and forgiveness. Amen.
Thank you.
Reverend West, thank you so much
Beautiful.
for being here today. We're so grateful for your time.
Yeah, this was
your
fun.
wisdom.
Maybe I'll see you again.
Sounds good. Look forward.
And thank you for tuning into today's episode. We hope that you will continue your journey on our next episode. Talk with you soon.